Okay. I'm just going to start out with a few Buddhist prayers. You're free to join me if you know them, and if not, I'll go into them eventually. So, Sashi Buki Joji Meto Dan Rigra Linchin Hinde Gambadi Sange Shindu Mida Wagi Dogu Nanda Shinga Judo Jo Ido Guru Rada Mandala Gamde Yatayami Sange Judo Zugi Jonam La Janju Badu Dani Gazuchi Dagi Juji Gibe Sunangi Dola Benju Sange Dubasho Sage Jura Zogi Jonam La Joju Badu Dani Gazuji Dagi Juji Gibe Sunangi Dola Benji Sage Dubasho Sage Jura Zogi Jonam La Joju Badu Dani Gazuji Dagi Juji Gibe Sunangi Dola Benji Sage Dubasho. That's going for refuge to the Buddha Dharma Sangha and generating bodhicitta as a motive for teaching or listening. Um, so I promised I would go into a scientific approach. When I met Lama Yeshe back at Santa Cruz, the first thing he told me to do was go to Nepal and take a November course with his student, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And in the interim, I had to go back home, actually to the East Coast where I live now, and I had to make money to go to Nepal. And while I was here, I met Kensur, Ari Kensur, Serme Kensur Rinpoche, who offered to teach me. And anyway, I went to Nepal and then I came back and I continued my studies with Ari Kensur Rinpoche. But while I was in Nepal, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, very interesting figure. When he was born, he started climbing up the mountain near his house, and his parents would have to rescue him off the side of the mountain. And as soon as he could talk, his first words were, "I'm the Luudo Lama. That's my cave." In his previous life, he had spent the last like 30 years of his life as a yogi retreating in the cave and became known as the Luudo Lama. And so a lot of people thought he was indeed the incarnation of this Luudo Lama. Later, when he was about 6 or 7, his uncle took him on a tour of different monasteries. And when he got to Sarajay Monastery, he looked at his uncle and he said, "You can go. I'm not leaving. I'm staying here." And then he started training as a monk and became quite influential as a monk in the West. So anyway, he was teaching this course, and he was teaching a very unique subject called Lam Rim, which means the stages of the path to enlightenment. And as he began, in fact, what I'm going to start teaching is based on Lam Rim. It's called the three principal aspects of the path. Um, as Lama Zopa Rinpoche started to teach on Lam Rim, he said to all of us, we were all Western hippies who had gone to Nepal to learn wisdom. And he looked at us all and he said, I hear a lot of things about people wanting to change this or that aspect of Buddhism to modernize it. And he said, be very careful. Be very careful. It's been ages of sages and yogis and enlightened beings who have put the structure into this. He said, so be very careful not to rush in and alter things until you know it so deeply that you really understand it. And he said, but one thing that might be really useful to add to the Lam Rim is to begin with something on past and future lives, because most Westerners don't believe in past and future lives. And of course, from a Buddhist point of view, if you don't, then it's very hard to access the rest of the logic that's going to come. So I thought I would take his advice and start there. I noticed that in this series that I mentioned that I'm referring to as I teach these classes, that's where the Dalai Lama starts as well. He does an introduction on the overview of different religions and what a spiritual person is, and you know how society shakes down into disbelievers, people who are hostile to religion, then religious people, and among religious people, a small subset are Buddhists. Most religious people believe in a God who controls everything. And as I said last time, Buddhists, they accept some aspects of an enlightened, all-knowing, all-compassionate guide. In fact, they think there are many such beings who have developed those capacities, but they stop short of all-powerful. They don't believe all the chaos in the world is created by any divine source. That's all human made. In the Buddhist point of view, it's our afflictions of mind and our ignorance and our constant desire and fear that drive most of the tragedies, human-made tragedies in the world. So, anyway, going back to Lama Zopa Rinpoche's main point, a good place to start is in past and future lives. And in chapter 1 of this book, that's exactly where the Dalai Lama starts. He breaks it down very well because he knows science. Since a young age, he's been studying Western science and talking with Western scientists. So if you look at where science is when it gets to the mind, there are two schools. One's called the materialist school. It's also known as the reductionist by us, people like us, who are Buddhists. Um, in that school of thought, the mind is the brain. And everything that we think, everything we feel is a byproduct of neurological interactions and neurotransmitters. That point of view has been there for a long time. You can date it back to ancient Greece, right? And there's some truth to that, in that we cannot move our hands or talk or have sensory phenomena occur without a complex biological process. And so I can understand why science has arrived at that conclusion, but from a Buddhist point of view, it's a mistaken conclusion. So the Dalai Lama really breaks it down well here. If we look at the current science, now they can, through CAT scans and MRIs and other things like that, they're able to trace the neural workings in minute detail. Recently, there was a study where through neuroimaging, researchers were able to put out a approximation of the stream of thoughts in some of the people where they were neuroimaging what was happening in their brain, which is pretty amazing, right? That they're able to do that. However, even though the neuroimaging is that precise and complex, still it cannot discern the difference, for instance, between physical pain and compassion. Interesting, isn't it? Compassion, while we experience compassion as a positive emotion, even though it's a little bit sad when we look at what others are going through, including ourselves, it tends to register on the neural pathways associated with pain. However, it's not really a painful emotion, is it? And so the ability to accurately understand what's happening at a cognitive or emotional level from neuroimaging is not exact. It misinterprets, nor can it actually see the mind. So, what is the mind from a Buddhist point of view? Um, most of our Western health and mental health system is focused on the body, the neurology, the nervous system, and the body. Buddhism is the exact opposite. Most everything in it is focused on the mind and developing the mind. Um, the Buddhist point of view is we're soon going to lose this body anyway. so, it's good to keep it healthy. It's good to use it well, but really what we should be taking care of is the mind, because the view is that the mind's going to go forward. When it gets into defining the mind, um, there are different levels of coarseness and subtlety pointed out in the Buddhist texts. The more coarse levels of mind are related to our sensory input. Of course, our sensory input is based on our sense faculties. Without a functioning eye faculty, we won't have visual perception. Same with hearing. We need a ear that works with smell, nose, with taste. We need a tongue that works with tactile sensation. We need our ability to sense tactily. And then there's the mental faculty and all that's involved in that. So gross or coarse mind is somewhat dependent on our physiology. However, there's a more subtle level of mind that we notice in dreams. Freud and Jung got all into this, the analysis of dreams, and put a lot of merit in the idea that our dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. I think that was Freud who said that, right? But Jung didn't disagree. Anyway, I might have mixed them up. but, but the Buddhist view is that when we're dreaming, and then at different points of the dying process, more subtle parts of the mind start to become obvious. It's a little bit like in the sunlight, you can see a lot of details, but as the night comes, the details get lost, right? And similarly, as the coarse mind starts to lose its ability to function, more subtle parts of the mind manifest, and you can't see all that detail of the physical, visual, auditory world, tangible world, but an inner world becomes more transparent. And this is similar to how your eyes acclimate in the dark. At first, when the lights go out, you can't see anything, but over time, some subtle parts of your environment can start to manifest if there's a little light in the room that you're in. So those subtle parts of the mind that manifest during dreams, and then when you die, it's thought that those subtle parts of the mind start to become more obvious in the intermediate state after you die. But those two are coarse compared to what's called the clear light of death, which is considered the most subtle part of the mind. In the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Buddha said, there is no mind in mind. The nature of mind is clear light. That's a famous quote from the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So what it means is it's very, well, I'll say it this way. It's very hard for us to directly perceive the clear nature of mind, because the way the mind functions is that it functions in images. If we're having a visual cognition, there's a visual image associated with it. Same with an auditory cognition or a smell or a taste or a feel. When we're thinking, there are different internal images that we use to um, organize our thoughts. And so almost every instance that the mind is interacting with the environment or within yourself, it's focused on some image. So it's very hard to see it in its actual nature of just being clarity and knowing. That's how it's defined in Tibetan Buddhist debate texts. The mind is clarity and knowing. Its clarity aspect allows it to take the form of whatever it's perceiving, for that to appear in it like a reflection in a mirror. Its knowing aspect is it being able to apprehend, oh, I'm seeing the color blue, or I'm hearing Wilson's gravelly voice, or I'm sensing that it's a little cold outside. So in meditation, and there are lots of practices like this in Tibetan Buddhism, you can eventually purify the mind to such a degree that the mind can settle in on its clear light nature during meditation. It's a very advanced practice. Sometimes that's called Mahamudra or the Great Completion. Dzogchen has different titles to it, but it's possible, and many meditators have experienced it. It's that clear light nature that actually is what has traveled from life to life. The thought in Buddhism is that most subtle aspect of the mind, its clear light nature, is indestructible. Why, you might ask, right? Everything in nature that's physical is destructible. But that most subtle, clear light nature is immaterial. It's not made of any substance, any tangible substance, which is one reason scientists have such a hard time tracking it and clearly perceiving it. So it's traveled from a Buddhist point of view since beginningless time. It has no first cause. And this is where, and again, feel free to debate me on this, but this is where the Buddhist logic starts to challenge some of the preconceptions you find in Western thought. So if you look at our bodies, we all have a body, we all have a mind. And those two things interact during the course of our life. Where did the body come from? Well, we can trace back previous moments of the body. And where we arrive is that our parents had two unique substances that came together, and that formed an ovum. And then we kept feeding it. And then eventually we came out with the body, right? So the body is purely from physical causes, and you can trace that back. But if you trace back that subtle continuum of mind, it's immaterial. It can interact with physical matter. But when you go back to that conception of the body, for that mind to occur, the Buddhist point of view is there must have been a similar cause, a cause of mental nature, immaterial nature, that must have preceded that conception for that subtle moment of mind to exist at the time of conception. It must come from a previous cause of similar nature. What is that previous cause? The continuum from a previous life. So that's the Buddhist conclusion. So this is all fine and good, but is there any research to support this, right? In his book, His Holiness actually mentions a few. He has a load of experiential um, reports that lead to his conclusion. In fact, his own life started in this kind of way, where he was identified as the um, incarnation of the great 13th Dalai Lama. Um, he talks in his book about a Tibetan boy who was able to read without being taught. And so a lot of people say, oh, it must have been some advanced mutation in his neurology. Well, yeah, but how did he know how to read? Anybody teaching him? There are similar examples of kids who show an ability to speak an unlearned language, a language they'd never been exposed to. Well, how does that happen? That's one example. Um, then he talked about a girl who had many memories of a previous life. Um, so she would tell her parents, and her parents eventually reached out to the presumed parents of the previous life. And they came to India and met with the girl. And after hearing all her memories, they were convinced, yeah, this was our daughter. so, so then they kind of adopted her along with her birth parent. But there are lots of stories. There are lots of studies, actually. Ian Stevenson, an American psychiatrist who liked to study paranormal phenomena, spent decades over in Asia studying cases like this. And he went in with a very empirical mindset, like, how do I actually do a scientific study of these kinds of claims of young children? And he studied, I think, something like 2,000 cases. And then he had a team of researchers looking into it. And it's really amazing to read. If you haven't come across it, he published several books through the University of Virginia Press that you can read. And a institute called, I'm trying to remember what they call themselves now, um, in the University of Virginia, um, I think, behavioral health department. There's a whole unit now that does these kind of studies. Um, and so they're accumulating more studies of young children who report memories of a previous life. The scientific community at large has rejected the research, not because it's bad research, but just because it's so outside the box of how most scientists think about the body and the mind. However, um, recently I was able to publish something with the Journal of Mind and Behavior that passed muster with a scientific review. And so I'll put that link to the article in the next class announcement if you want to read it, but it gets into the research. And one of the researchers there, I wish I could remember the name of it's the Department of Perceptual Studies. That's what they're calling it now. One of their researchers is a guy named Bruce Grayson, and he started out with a researcher who was very famous, who wrote a book called Life After Death, I think was the name of his first book. But he was a doctor who had accounts of near-death experiences from his patients. And then he started researching it, and Bruce Grayson helped him and developed a huge, he started an institute for the study of near-death experience called IANS. And they've just got thousands, thousands and thousands of cases that they've studied. Many of them, the people who get resuscitated, have very vivid accounts of the death period that they were in, very often out of body perspectives of what was happening in the operating room at the time of their resuscitation. And these vivid experiences of what was happening in the operating room then get reviewed by the medical personnel who were in the room at the time of their death, and uncanny accuracy with the details of what the person can recount. Sometimes they can recount events that happened far away from the dying body. So it's not just sensory input at the time of death. And there are other um, areas of research that bear out that there may be times when the mind is functioning independently of the neurology. And I would put to you this, from a logical point of view, isn't it true that if there is even a single instant of the mind functioning independently of the neurology, it means the mind is not a material thing that's totally dependent on the neurology. It contradicts that whole.
But I agree with you.
So I think empirically, there's more evidence for the Buddhist point of view, I think, than for the Western reductionist theory that the mind is totally dependent on the brain.
I have
So
two things to say. One, I have a friend who didn't know this until way later in her life. Um, the right side of her brain is almost not there. They couldn't believe it when they did an MRI. She's very left. The left is over, and it lights up and everything, and the right is just, and so and she always was kind of a quirky person. I grew up with her, so I knew her really well. Um, so she went on and I'm not going to say her name because she doesn't want it associated, but she she has a regular job which she's going to retire from, but she writes for Disney. She writes Disney cartoon characters. She comes up with characters. Super imaginative, really wonderful, kind-hearted person, but she's just very left-brained. And I was just amazed that somebody could survive like that. So, that's a case where, part of the brain made up for the other part that wasn't there.
that's a whole other body of research that kind of,
Yeah, but I mean, it goes to show you that, you don't need what they think you need for your brain for you to function. Let's put it that way.
it was a major revolution in neurology when scientists discovered that areas of the neurology can start to adapt when some areas of the neurology are lost or damaged.
Well,
And so
I even had that with a tumor because it was in my speech center, which is how my husband knew something was wrong because I just kind of shut up and just said yes and no, which, as you know, is not like me. But anyway, so he told my doctor and I got an MRI, and it took a while not to be really confused all the time. He had to actually make my appointments because my brains were scrambled, and even having to talk and find the right words sometimes was real difficult. So I had that experience. Do you know what I mean?
mhm.
But also, this is what I want to say. When I was little, knew that I had lived before and I had memories of it. And so I would say things to my parents. I was really little. My dad was pretty good about it, and he called it my imagination. So I thought, wow, this imagination stuff is great because I had no idea what that meant, but he put a label on it and I was okay with it. My mom, who had a mentally ill mom, did not deal very well with stuff. So I made comments like, "You're my mother, but you're not my mother from before." And she got unglued. What are you talking about? And then when my dad came home, she thought, well, I could hear everything, but she thought it was safe to tell my dad, you know what Sharon said? I mean, she was really, honestly, totally freaked out. So Oh, and then I had the discussions with my aunt because my grandfather died, and I told her, no, you don't die and go to heaven. You die and you come back again, little, and then you grow old and then you die and you come back. And my aunt got unglued because, well, we were Portuguese and very Catholic, and there were crosses and pictures of Jesus with the bleeding heart everywhere. So, God, did we get in an argument? And finally, she just said, all right, I'm going to heaven and you're not. That was the end of that conversation. But what it taught me was don't talk about it. And so, I would go to catechism with nuns. And so I would pray every night to God to forgive me because they told me I had a soul that got black marks, if I did a sin, to please forgive me for believing that I lived before because it was wrong, but I can't help it. That's what I believe. I mean, that's how crazy it got for me. So I think in Western culture, maybe parents would be a little bit better about it, but I think kids would get a lot of pushback because I sure did, that. So a lot of the memories that I had got, you know, squashed pretty good. I mean, I learned not to talk about it.
When I was an intern at National Naval Medical Center during my training as a social worker, we would have
Mhm.
ground rounds where psychiatrists and psychologists would present cases. And one of my first grand rounds, one of them presented the cases of a young child who was having past life memories, just like you're talking about, Sharon.
Mhm.
And as I listened, I had already studied Buddhism, so I knew I had a different viewpoint than anybody else in the room, I think. Um, but as they went around with the psychiatrists on their diagnosis, I was hearing things like, oh, maybe the child has delusions of grandeur, maybe it's a psychotic disorder, maybe, and they were going on and
That was
sharing.
my mom. Yeah.
And And later I went to my supervisor and I told her, well, a guy named Ian Stevenson has done research on cases like this. Would you like to see an article? And I was able to give her an article. But it struck me that it wasn't safe to have a divergent opinion of the mind possibly being a continuum. And so I think that's where science kind of got stuck. It's not, it's like,
Yeah, and I
I
didn't
can't
even
hear you.
present it as a continuum. It was more like, no, you just keep coming back again. That's what I knew, as far as Buddhist stuff goes, I was raised Catholic, but what can I say? Um,
Well, in the case of the Dalai Lama, when they found him, a long story how they found him, but when they did find him, he was a young boy, and he came out. He came up to one of the search party and said, "Oh, you're Shara Aga," which means you're a lama from Sera Monastery. And they hadn't announced where they had come from, and he was living in a different region of Tibet than Sera Monastery. And then he said, "Those are my beads." And he pointed to a rosary around the neck of the lead lama and he grabbed them. "Those are mine." And that rosary had belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama. And so then they did testing, and again, he chose the belongings of the previous 13th Dalai Lama from similar items that they would put out. Many signs like that. One of his teachers, um, Gyabje Trijang Rinpoche, when he passed away, later a search party came to a house. They were looking for him. His main attendant did the search. And the father of the household told them a story that when his um, only boy was young, the father would scold him for drinking too much milk. And the young boy said, "Don't worry, Dad. I have 7 cows in my household. Peldon's taking care of them for me." Well, Peldon was the name of the search party, the head of the search party, the attendant, and he was running the household of the previous Trijang Rinpoche, which had 7 cows in the household. And so instantly Peldon, okay, this But these things, if they happen to you, they're very hard to dismiss. I don't know if anybody here has had an out of body experience, for example, but when that kind of thing happens, it's like hard to just brush it away. Um, those kinds of things happen to about anywhere from 15% to 20% of the population. And mostly when they get to be college age or if there's a near death experience. And so it's a relatively small part of the population that's experienced these things, but they've been well documented and well researched. So I'll get that
Yeah,
paper to
I've
you.
had that happen, and the reading I did, it was saying it was sleep paralysis. The hell it was. I was wide awake, so I was not asleep, couldn't move was out of my body, and bleh. And I
Well,
was so scared. I was trying to call for my mother. That's how, frightening it was to me because I didn't know what it was.
one thing that I've noticed as I've read the research is that the materialist oriented scientists are very eager to find some way to dismiss any such unusual phenomena. And they'll think of all sorts of ways like sleep paralysis or delusion, or, to think of all sorts of different possible ways to deny it. But if anybody can show a time that the mind functions independently of the neurology, they'll rush right in and try to say, no, that's impossible. They'll give you a
I'll
zillion
give
reasons.
you a diagnosis for it.
I saw one, Tucker at the Department of Perceptual Studies. Um, one of the children he found who had memories of a previous life was a young boy who was just fascinated with airplanes. And when he started to be able to talk, he told his parents about being a fighter pilot during World War II, got shot down. And they didn't believe him. They thought it was absurd, but he was so insistent that at one point his father and mother did some research back into pilots who had died, and they were able to locate a battle, an air fight that totally corresponded to what the boy was saying. And they were able to find a pilot who died in the air fight that had every attribute that the boy had attributed to his previous life. And
Uh,
this it was well researched. When it reached the news, whoever did the news story brought in a Western scientist to comment. And the Western scientist immediately dismissed it, of course. And he said, well, the parents probably want to believe this. And so they probably inadvertently suggested things to their child. so, and so that's kind of the attitude. But if, like, for instance, in your case, Sharon, most parents, particularly Western parents, are horrified if their kid starts talking about stuff like this.
no, yeah, because I didn't know anything about reincarnation or coming. I mean, that is not something that in any way, shape, or form was I exposed to, nor did anyone around me talk about it. That was just what I remembered.
Yeah,
And I
they
just
try to
thought
drive
that
those.
everybody had that. That's, when you're little, that's how you, so.
Well, they tried to drive those thoughts out of the kid, if anything, like the case I mentioned from Grand Rounds when I was back at Naval Medical Center. So that's why I think there are fewer cases reported in Western materialist science oriented countries. And also in this country, we've got the interpretation of Christianity that you only have one life. So if you're not a materialist, if you're in that camp, then there's little room for the kid who says, oh, I remember a previous life. And they got a little next to none chance of surviving those first utterances. But you were you were strong. So you made it.
No, when you, it's just that feeling like when you know something, and that was all. So no matter what they said to me, I was little enough and young enough to know that I knew that. It was an experience. I knew that. So they didn't talk me out of it. They sort of just made me be quiet about it. So that's what happened.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And yeah, Lisa, you're muted, Lisa. So
There we go. That's better. So this is a little different, but I think it's related. But when I was very young, I used to have dreams that were very they I mean not just regular dreams, I had them too, but so not infrequently I would have special dreams. And when I woke, I knew they were very special dreams, and they would be in living color. I would know if it was either me or somebody close to me, and I could feel what the relationship was. But I would dream of things that hadn't happened yet in incredible detail, day, time. But I mean, just still some of the dreams that I can remember, the placement of things in the house or whatever. Incredible detail, especially the colors. Um, and and when they would happen, if I told some friends of mine, and then they came down, they came, well, first ones that were, about family things. The mother would get very, very angry. When I dreamt that her mother was going to die, and I thought I should, that day, let her know that that was going to happen. It was going to not be a good day. She got really, really angry, really, really angry, and just thought I was just being nasty and hateful. But even as like a teenager, um, it happened a number of times, and car accident, just various different things. But my friends called me a witch, and they like freaked out, and it was very uncomfortable. So I really didn't like having those dreams anymore. But what I became very aware of was I figured the only way those things would happen if they really, I realized that there was really no such thing as time. That time is something linear time, that's something, a construct that we have created to sort of order our thoughts and order our minds and be able to make sense of things. But in fact, there really is no such thing as linear time. And that I felt like it was a privileged place that I got to go to, because my mind wasn't full of polluted stuff. I mean, I've always been a child of the woods, the forest. That's just always been me, and always been, pretty loving and compassionate person. Um, but after I kind of got shamed or whatever, I didn't want to have those dreams anymore. I really didn't want to. And so I kind of blocked them. And now that I understand what they were a lot better, of course I don't have them anymore, but I think in part is because my mind lacks the purity that I had then that allowed those dreams to come in. And I think the reason I had those dreams also, not just because of the timelessness, but because there's a universal place that we all belong to. Just why I'm a bit of a pantheistic Buddhist, but I was watching a show the other day on what did you call it? No, when people die and can see themselves. What did you call that? I forget.
out of body experience.
Yes, out of body experiences. I watched a couple shows on that, and both of them, the people were consistently talking about that universal place, um, that that they got to see sort of, and it just brought kind of that reality back to me. Like she was talking about when you know things, it's a knowing. I mean, that's just what it is. And both the timelessness, and that place are two things that I've become acutely aware of. And I'm wondering if there's anything that allows for that in Buddhism, or am I just kind of defective and weird?
Um, I'll go to research first. So
Please.
in the research about clairvoyance and those kind of noumenal, Carl Jung called those noumenal dreams when they were very vivid and foretold some greater truth. One way I suggest, if you have dreams like that, to check them is to see if they correspond with things that actually happen. Because sometimes the mind can make up all sorts of stuff. And so you can have very vivid images that are based on emotions and thoughts and other things like that that may not correspond to actual events. But if you're having very vivid things like that occur to you, and then later they correspond to something that happens, then that, of course, makes you think, what's that about? Right? And then
Right? I mean, they had names. I had times and days and colors, and I one time described this lady's house to her, and I didn't know it was her house. I'd never been there. I mean,
there
and it
was
was in Australia to boot, you know, just some weird stuff. But I write them down when they happen too, because you know when you wake up that it's one of those special dreams.
well, there was I mentioned this before, but there was a lama who came by here named Ima Dorje. And one night he was talking to Sharon and I in the kitchen. He had a friend there too, Nolan, um, Tutin Nolan. Um, but he talked about this lama who was thought to be very clairvoyant. He was back in the time that Mao Zedong was fighting with Chiang Kai-shek for control of China. And to demonstrate his clairvoyance, later when Mao came to power, this lama was arrested and put in a gulag and tortured. And one day, the commandant of the concentration camp brought him forward and said, "You're a cheat. You tell people you're clairvoyant and you take their money. If you're so clairvoyant, tell me what my house looks like in Beijing." And apparently, this lama told him exactly what his house looked like down to the details, so much that the commandant let him free. So that was kind of to demonstrate his clairvoyance. But apparently, when Mao Zedong came to him, Mao Zedong was asking him, "Am I going to win in the battle against Chiang Kai-shek?" And this lama said, "In this life, you'll get your wish. In your next life, you'll be a hell being." And so studies on the clairvoyance have been really murky because there are charlatans and there is a lot of room for error because of people mistaking cognitive events as clairvoyance. So it's a very murky area. But in the paper, I'll send out one study that I found kind of interesting was a study that the military did called Stargate, in which this is back when Russia was kind of studying telepathy and they were doing it for military purposes. And so the US started their own study called Stargate. Anybody who's seen the movie Men Who Stare at Goats, that movie was based on the Stargate studies. But there's even murkiness in the Stargate studies. The reason they discontinued it is that inter-evaluator differences and things like that kind of made it so they couldn't use it militarily. But there was one guy who was quite, it seems like he was quite clairvoyant. They would do remote studies where they would tell him to look at a certain thing remotely and describe it. And he just had uncanny ability to point out the details from afar. In one example of precognition, and this gets into the time issue, which I'll get to in a second from a Buddhist point of view, but in a precognition incident, he was able to describe the launch of a Soviet submarine, details of how it looked, and a special channel that was being dug to launch it. And at that time, intelligence in the US had no information on any such project and they dismissed it. But then several months later, just as he described, the Soviets launched a submarine that had down to the detail everything he had described, including the channel they had dug. So
Oh,
there are some things like that studied. In terms of time, time is a concept in Buddhist philosophy, and it's a relative thing. Um, it's demarked by the impermanence, the rise and fall of things, compound phenomena. In terms of is there a place beyond time, I hear different things in the scriptures. clearly, uh, the Buddha had an ability to predict things way ahead, and several clairvoyants seem to have that ability. So how that works with the rise and fall of things, I have yet to know for sure. So I will keep my mind open and try to arrive.
Quantum physics is finding a lot of things now that
Right.
sort of match with Buddhist philosophy. Like some of the studies where it's the investigators' thought of how the outcome's going to come out is how it comes out, particles being where the investigator expects them to be. They're I keep seeing stuff about, there is no such thing as time. There was another, I don't know that it was quantum physics, but another study that was coming out saying that there are multi dimensions. And it's funny because when I was 7, way before Star Trek or any of that, I remember sitting there telling my mother that there's somebody sitting next to me. We can't see them, but they're living right beside us, and and I didn't know reincarnation either. And I remember my mother calling the minister to try to get me straight. And I just looked at him and said, God recycles everything else. How come if we're so important, he doesn't recycle us too? So
Well,
they didn't convince me anything, but I left them sort of like,
well,
but there's, go on.
in quantum mechanics, one interesting phenomenon that I think you're referring to is called entanglement, and that's where in one lab, scientists are seeing how a particle travels, and then in a corresponding lab on the other side of the world, they see a reverse entanglement at the exact same timing. I
Yeah,
don't know
it's
how the
mind
two.
blowing, but it
I don't
fits
know how
right
the
in
two.
with Buddhist philosophy.
I think so too. Found quantum mechanics to be incredibly validating for those experiences that I had. That entanglement was absolutely one of them. But I have just to clarify, I have never thought of myself as a clairvoyant, and for two reasons. One is because I have never had control over it. I could never go to sleep and say, "Oh, please let me have one of those dreams," and have one. Never happened. Ever have I like wanted to have it, be able to see something and seen it. That's just never happened. And I've always known that it was a gift. It was a real gift to be able to go into that place, wherever it is. And I agree with you. I think there are many dimensions. I really do. And there's a place where they're all there. Um, I can't explain that one anymore, but I think that's really true.
Well,
Well,
if you look at some of the stuff that Einstein thought, which is amazing because he
Right.
didn't really have a way to measure all this stuff he figured out, that time actually bends, around things. So somehow he knew that. I don't know how he knew it, but I saw pictures of it. It's hard to watch some of his stuff because I get so spun in after a while. It's like, what
well,
are they talking
well,
about? But
I'm going to say this from a Buddhist point of view, kind of try to boil this down into a Buddhist point of view. Um, the two thoughts that make it impossible to really make progress in the Buddhist path. One is the thought there's no future life, no past life, no karma. That thought, if you have it solidly in your mind, why practice a spiritual path? Why, you know, every bit of logic in the Buddhist path won't fit if you have that. The other thought that cuts out the root of the path is there's no such thing as the possibility of enlightenment or transcendence of suffering. And if that thought is firm in you, then it's going to be really hard to understand the Buddhist path.
Can you say
But
more about that? I don't get that. I don't understand.
well, last time, I don't think you were here, Lisa, but last time I mentioned there's a gesture you'll see on statues of the Buddha like this. And the way Lama Zopa Rinpoche described that to me when I was over in Kathmandu is this little finger represents the paths in Buddhism for beings of small scope or initial scope to get them thinking about what's coming after this life and to take care of their future lives. This ring finger represents the paths and commons for a middle level being who wants to be free of the cycle of birth and death and suffering completely. Nirvana is a famous word for that. The longer middle finger corresponds to the path of a great being who wants to attain full enlightenment, which includes all knowing for the benefit of all beings, to be able to guide all beings beyond suffering. And then this circle represents that state of full enlightenment. And so I think if you don't believe in past and future lives, then why even from an initial point of view would you want to work for a better future life?
Why can't you believe in no, no, in that time is all the same thing and still believe that?
Well, you could, but why do anything about it then?
Well, because there's still the cause and effect.
Well, that's karma, right? But
Right.
for karma to work, if you create a cause, the whole idea of karma, if you create a psychological cause, then eventually that will give some kind of fruition, which
Mhm.
represents linear time. That represents linear time.
But
And so,
the way we think it does, but I mean, that's almost like the only, because I don't get it. I totally don't understand how it all works, but I don't think that people, that quantum mechanics, quantum physicists, uh, don't function on linear time. They do, even though they totally understand quantum entanglement.
um, well, there's a lot to unpack in those ideas. But put it this way, that circle in that gesture, that teaching gesture, represents um, the definition of what it is to be a Buddha is to be a being who's eliminated the mental afflictions completely from the mind. Those are what are thought to cause us the suffering. And then they've also eliminated obstacles to complete knowledge. And that's that sense of omniscience or complete knowing. Um, the Buddhist argument is because the mind is that clarity and knowing, and at its subtlest level, it's indestructible. Then, from that point of view, that clear knowing, clear light mind can be purified to the point that it has no obstacles to knowledge. And at that state, what is that like? Is it timeless or something? I don't know. All I can say is, I think maybe there's such a thing, but I can't tell you what it would be like experientially. It blows my mind to try to think of it. Um, but that's the best I could do for that. If somebody doesn't believe that they can find a state beyond suffering, then again, why pursue a spiritual path? I heard Lama Zopa Rinpoche say, if this is our only life and there's no karma, no future life, no enlightenment, then why not use drugs and drink beer? Because at least you'll mitigate your suffering until you die from cirrhosis or something. You know what I mean? And so, anyway, he was joking, of course, when he said that. But you can see how some of those are called wrong views from a Buddhist point of view. The view that there's no past and future life, there's no karma, there's no enlightenment. Um, so all of this discussion in the beginning is to try to open your mind to thinking, what if the mind is a continuum? what if what we do now does determine what we become? What if what we are now is the result of many past things that we've done? What if we have the capacity not only to free ourselves from suffering, but to become completely enlightened and completely awakened? As long as you at least entertain that, then the rest of the Buddhist path will make sense. If you don't entertain that, then you'll kind of give up. So that's why I wanted to really spend time on this and have the debate. Again, if anybody's holding back on a debate question, I urge you to bring it up. If not now, then as we go along, because otherwise, once the doubts are there, if you don't seek some kind of clarification, they'll remain. I remember when I first started out, I met Ari Kentzer Rinpoche. I was straight out of college, and I had been raised in a scientific family. My dad was kind of scientific, and occasionally he would be talking and teaching something, and I'd have this feeling, oh, from a scientific viewpoint, that's just wrong. And I would want to ask a question that I knew would challenge him, but I was seriously, this is how grandiose I was at that age. I would seriously worry that I would destroy his faith in the Buddhist path if I asked the question. And so then at some point I told myself, well, I'm going to ask it anyway. And every time I asked a question like that, I was amazed at how sophisticated his answer was and how deep his knowledge was. And it would blow me out of the water. And I would realize, no, there's no question I can ask that's off limits. They're all fine. And so I hope you have that sense as we go along, because as you hear it, if you don't ask those questions again, it'll stay in your heart. I remember one time, I'll just say this, there's a Buddhist ceremony where you imagine offering the world. And I called him on the phone one day and I said, so if the world is shaped with Mount Meru and the continents, why has no scientist ever seen it? It's kind of challenging. And he kind of giggled and he said, well, the scientists have their own karma, so they see things in a certain way. And, you know, Buddhists have another karma. Um, and he said that if you have a cup of water and you show it to a hungry spirit, they'll see pus and blood. And if you show it to a human, they'll see water. But if you show it to a divine being, they'll see nectar. And it's all based on their karmic predisposition. And I just thought, I nod on it for a while. My debate is still out on that subject. But he was always fun to talk to. After he answered me, he said, this time, we don't have time to go the long way. We have to go the short way. And that was the first time I got a sense that he could see past and future lives, and he could see mine in particular, what I needed. And what he was referring to is in ancient Tibet, this is how the path would go. You'd meet a teacher, they'd teach you something, then you go and retreat on it and try to realize it. And if you had questions, you go back to them and ask them questions. And it could take 20 years to get through it. But anyway, so he said, we don't have time to go the long way, but I still invite you as we go along to ask any question. So all that said, I'm going to share the text I promised we would go over today, just to get us started. And please continue to debate as we go through each part. Okay, can you see it? Is it showing on your screens?
Nope.
That's probably because I didn't share my screen. Okay, here we go. There it is. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So Tsongkapa, the person who wrote this text, is a very short text, actually. but it's packed with unbelievable amount of information. He wrote this after he had become the top scholar in Tibet in his time, and he had studied all the great texts of Buddhism, and he defeated everybody in debate, whoever wanted to debate him. But he started to have um, encounters with the Bodhisattva Manjushri, who's considered the embodiment of wisdom. He had met a clairvoyant lama named Umapa, who had constant visions of Manjushri, and Manjushri would teach him things. And Tsongkapa used him as kind of his interpreter for Manjushri, and would ask Umapa questions to ask Manjushri. But somewhere along the way, Tsongkapa would be able to, he developed the ability to actually meet with Manjushri directly and ask him questions. And he also got introduced to the stages of the path to enlightenment. And it just cleared away all of his questions as he studied the path to enlightenment. And so he wrote this text. And in a way, he attributed it directly to Manjushri. But again, it contains all the main elements of the Buddhist path. It's called Lam, which means path, So, which means principle or main. Nam means types, aspects. Sum means three. Lam, So, Nam, Sum, the three main aspects of the path. So I mentioned those three levels of beings. This contains teachings for all those three levels of spiritual aspirants on the path. And it starts out with an homage to his teachers. You can see how the phonetic sounds over here, but I'll go to the Tibetan and just get us started as a springboard. Jetsun means venerable. Lama means guru. Nam is plural. Venerable gurus. La, to you. Chaselo means I prostrate. Chak means hand. Sel means bestow. So it literally means please bestow on me what you hold. And so there are tons of teachings on this. And I'm only going to be able to kind of get us started. The third Dalai Lama said that the reason we're not enlightened now is either we've never in our past lives met somebody who was an authentic spiritual guide, or we did meet with such a being, but we blew it. That's my words, blew it. You would say we just didn't properly listen to what they had to say and then follow their advice. So the idea is that there are beings that are available who have cleared away their obstacles of the afflictions, their obstacles to full knowledge, who are imbued with direct understanding of how things are, or at least close to it. We're going in that direction. And if we find someone like that, it behooves us to try to make a relationship with them and try to listen to them and try to download what they've learned so that we can know how to proceed. So at the beginning of a text, very often you'll see this in the Buddhist tradition, there's an homage to one's teachers as a dependent arising to be able to compose a text that's authentic and that's unmistaken. So that's what Tsongkapa is doing. As I said, one of his personal teachers was the Bodhisattva Manjushri, who I think he relied heavily on for this particular text, but he had many, many teachers. He studied with every tradition in his time, and every teacher he had eventually saw him as a teacher because he was so advanced from a very young age. So he's going to talk just a little bit about this text, and I'm going to only be able to do the first verse, and then we'll come back to it, but just to whet your appetite for this a little bit. Gyalwa means a conqueror, a victorious one, and it's talking about the Buddhas. And again, they've eliminated the obstacles of the afflictions and the obstacles to knowledge, and they developed those three aspects I talked about before: the ability to choose their future lives, the ability to be free of any kind of suffering from the wheel of samsara, and the ability to completely become enlightened in order to help all beings and guide all beings. So the Buddhas, Sungrab is their speech, all the things they taught. Kun means all of them. Ginyingbo means the essence of everything they taught. Dun means meaning, the essential meaning of everything they've taught. So what Tsongkapa is claiming is he's about to teach us the essential meaning of everything that all the Buddhas have ever taught, their essence contained in a single short text. That's his claim. He's starting to whet our appetite. Gyaltse means the offspring of the Buddhas, the sons and daughters of the Buddhas, and that's a reference to bodhisattvas, beings who make up their mind they want to become completely enlightened to help all beings be free of suffering and find the ultimate state of bliss and well-being. Dhampa means holy, pure bodhisattvas. Namgi, by them. Nakpe Lam. This is the path that they praise. It's a path praised by all awakening warriors, all bodhisattvas. Geldan Dardu, Geldan means lucky ones. That's the bodhisattvas and beings on the path. Dardu means those who wish for liberation. Namgi, there. Jukmok Day, it's the entrance for them to the path of liberation. So all lucky ones. So the sense is that samsara is really a bad place to be from the Buddhist point of view. It's nothing but suffering. You try to find happiness again and again, but what it gives you is suffering in various forms. And so at some point, lucky ones are beings who decide, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be some better way to exist and be. And for those kinds of beings, this is Tsongkapa saying, this is the path. This is the entrance way to find what you're looking for. And then he makes a pledge. Jitar Nushin. Jitar means as much or as exactly. Nushin, as I am able. Dagi, by me. Shibarja, I'm going to tell you. So all of you who want to know the essence of all the meanings expressed by all the Buddhas, who want to follow the path praised by all the bodhisattvas, who want the entrance ways of the lucky ones who aspire for liberation, I'm going to tell you how to do it. So that's his pledge. And I think I should stop here because it's 5, but we'll come back to this. 2 weeks from now, I have a conflict in my schedule. So I won't be able to do this class until 4 weeks from now. But I'll send this recording of this out with the email about the next class, okay? By the way, I'll just show you an image. This is the image, the marquee of "You Are Here." The image of samsara, but we'll go through it bit by bit so you get a sense of what Tsongkapa is talking about. All right. I'll put up the concluding prayers. Sajibu Yuju Jime Dota Rivali Jinin Degin Badia Sangye Shindu Meda Uwagio Dugu Nanda Jinga Jubajo Iranguru Rana Mandala Gameya Dayami Gewa Dia Gewa Kon Sunam Yeshe Zozo Jin Sunam Yeshe Lejunwe Dabo Kunye Dobajo Janju Senjo Rinpoche, Amage Bana Gegeji, Yaba Nyaba Meba Yang, Gone Godu Bewashu, Gari Rawe Koe Shingande, Bendande Malu Juwene, Generative One Dancing Yaso Yi, Shebe Side Badu, Tangyo Chi. So anyway, thanks for joining and like the discussion. And I hope that we'll do more of that. So we'll come back to where we just left off. And if you have questions in between, feel free to email or save them up for next time. Okay.
Great.
Thanks, Wilson.
Everybody
Thank
share.
you. Take care,
Take
everybody.
care.
Thank you so much.